Mr. President.
The senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent to lift the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, families are looking to us to solve problems. They're looking at us to lower prices. They're looking for help getting food on the table or getting child care or getting their prescription filled. But what they are seeing instead today is Republicans lying about women, lying about health care, and lying about the tragic realities that families face when they learn that their baby has a fatal diagnosis and cannot survive long after birth. Of all the bills that we could be voting on right now, it's an absolute disgrace that Republicans are spending their first weeks in power attacking women, criminalizing doctors, and lying about abortion. This bill would create a new government mandate that would override the best judgment of grieving families who find out their fetus has a fatal condition. And it would create new, medically unnecessary barriers for doctors and patients at a time when doctors already have their hands tied when it comes to providing basic reproductive health care. Republicans' whole premise on this bill is a sham. Their whole bill is a disgrace, and we are here on the floor today to call it out. I'm not going to let anyone perpetuate the so-called abortion until birth myths and lies about people who have abortions and the providers who care for them. That is not how abortion works, and Republicans know it. Killing a baby is already illegal in every single state. In fact, we passed a law in 2002 that made that crystal clear. I'd know because I was here. It passed unanimously. Doctors already have legal obligation to provide appropriate medical care to any infant born in this country. And let's be clear, we already know Republicans' sham bill is not going to go anywhere, by the way. We've been here before. After all, Republicans held a vote on this bill a few years ago, and not a single Democrat who's still in the Senate today voted for it. Last time we voted on this bill, I spoke about something Republicans refused to acknowledge in this debate: the actual voices and experiences of women who receive a heartbreaking diagnosis late in pregnancy, when they actually go through what they actually go through, and how this bill would hurt them and their families. I spoke then about Judy. She's from Washington State. Her son's organs did not develop properly. One lung was 20% formed, and the other was missing entirely. I spoke about Lindsay. Her daughter had an aggressive, inoperable tumor growing into her brain, her heart, and her lungs. I spoke about Darla, one of her twins, who had serious medical complications. Not terminating that pregnancy would have put her other twins' health at risk. How you ignore something like that, I will never understand. But instead, Republicans are talking about things that simply do not happen. However, I have a different story to share today. You see, last time I shared those stories of women who were able to make the choice that was right for their family, but the stories now are of women who were denied that choice. And that is because Republicans have ripped away abortion rights, and state abortion bans have forced some women into the kind of nightmare Republicans are now seeking to take nationwide. In Florida, Deborah learned at 23 weeks her baby had no kidneys, and it would not survive after birth. She felt an abortion was the right step for her family. But Florida gave her no choice about what happened next. They forced her to carry a doomed pregnancy for months. Do you know what it's like to go for months pregnant with a baby you will not survive, and getting questions and comments like, "Oh, is this your first child? Are you excited?" Do you know what it's like fighting back tears as you try to decide whether to just nod politely or explain that actually your world is falling apart? And all the while knowing you have to go through all of this against your will. because some politician decided they knew better. Deborah avoided going out. She was afraid to go to the grocery store, and she said, quote, "I just went into a really dark place, essentially planning my son's birth and funeral at the same time." That's what abortion bans do. That is what happens when we take choice away from patients, when Republicans decide they know better. And Deborah's far from the only woman to go through this. Infant deaths from birth defects jumped in Florida following their abortion ban. Now, Republicans have a bill here to take that issue nationwide. That is what we're voting on here tomorrow. That is their top priority now that Trump's in office. And not only are they trying to take that abortion heartbreak nationwide, they are lying about what is at stake here and lying about what women like Deborah are going through, what their own policies will cause more women to go through. Shame on them. This is infuriating. Women like Deborah may not be billionaires, but they should still have their voices heard. And as long as I'm here, they will be. So here's my message for Republicans. Families don't need less choice about how to handle tragic medical news. What families actually need is affordable groceries. What families actually need is childcare. What they actually need is paid leave, quality health care, access to programs like SNAP and Medicaid, which Republicans want to cut to the bone. Now, I can't predict what attack Republicans will launch on abortion next, but I can promise we will be here to call them out, both for what they're trying to do, lie about women and doctors, and for everything they are failing to do, lowering costs and making life easier for folks back home. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Democratic leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I really want to thank my friend, our great leader on women's issues and on choice issues, Senator Murray, for leading this floor block. She has been indomitable on this issue. I can't think of a person who's done more to protect the rights of women than Patty Murray. So thank you for your great leadership. I want to thank all my other colleagues who have joined me as well. Look, it's Donald Trump's first week as president, and our Republicans are already escalating their war on women's reproductive freedoms. They didn't wait long. And the Republican desire to impose politicians politicians and their views on women's health and substitute their judgment for the judgment of the woman, her family, and her doctor continues. There are many different permutations and combinations of this, but it's always take the women's right away, let some politician for some ideological reason decide. This week, Senate Republicans will advance their so-called Born Alive bill, a bill we've all seen before, in which the Senate has squarely rejected in the past. The bill is deeply pernicious because it attacks women's health care through false narratives and outright fear-mongering. It seeks to make something that is illegal. It seeks to make something illegal that is already illegal. It's, in essence, Republican bill would substitute the judgment of qualified medical professionals, the wishes of millions of women and their families, with an ultra-right ideology. It's the long hand of injustice reaching down and hurting women from afar. And so much of the legislation is passed, frankly, by men who have really no understanding of what women go through when they're through difficult situations like the one my colleague from Washington State has outlined. This would harm the ability of medical professionals to provide health care based on evidence and on science. It would expose medical professionals to the risk of punishment and prosecution if they don't comply with the hard right. So we're here because we need to expose this bill exactly for what it is, myth-based fear-mongering. It's an attack on reproductive care. The anti-choice movement keeps trying to come up with these scenarios to try and scare people, but they misstate the facts and misstate the evidence. This bill is clear. It's an attack on reproductive care. It's anti-women, anti-family, anti-science. I'll tell my Republican colleagues this: Democrats will oppose any attempt to erode access to high-quality and safe reproductive care. Democrats will continue to fight for America's women, America's doctors, and America's families, who sometimes have to make heartbreaking, difficult decisions when serious complications arise during pregnancy. That's what makes this bill so horrible. It basically takes a woman who's in a very serious, difficult situation and tries to use her as political football. That's a bad, bad thing. So we should resoundingly reject this deeply partisan bill when it comes to the floor later this week. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Democratic whip.
Mr. President, this is not the first time we've considered this measure on the floor, nor the first time that I've spoken about it. I want to thank Senator Murray for leading this conversation on a very serious topic. I want to thank Senator Schumer for joining in this conversation as well. I couldn't agree with him more when he said, what we're trying to do with this bill is to make illegal what is already illegal. I'm going to make an invitation to anyone following this debate who wants to judge for themselves, to reach their own conclusion as to whether or not there are laws existent in America today which cover the situation described in this bill. I'm going to give you the name of a physician in Philadelphia who is serving a life sentence in prison for having violated the current law, and I want you to look it up and read it yourself. Don't take my words for it. His name is Kermit, K-E-R-M-I-T, Gosnell, G-O-S-N-E-L-L. Write that down if you want to follow this debate and want to draw your own conclusions by doing some personal research. Look it up on the internet, Kermit Gosnell. I'll tell you his story in a moment, but it proves the fact that we have existing laws that make this current bill unnecessary. Tomorrow marks the 52nd year since our nation's highest court issued a rule recognizing a woman's constitutionally protected right to choose. Roe versus Wade enshrined into law something that should have been a given in America. In America, women have the right to make decisions about their own bodies. And as a result of Roe, America's women took a giant leap forwards in gender equity. The decision in Roe afforded women the right to choose whether, when, and how to start a family. But after nearly 50 years of progress, in June 2022, the Supreme Court overruled Roe with Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, dragging women's rights half a century backwards. Following that decision, we saw Republican-led states open the floodgates to abortion restriction, laws that in some cases have had deadly consequences for women who could not access critical health care that they needed. Instead of addressing the health care crisis that Dobbs has unleashed, Republicans are now instead looking to make it even harder for women to access comprehensive and compassionate health care. Tomorrow, they will attempt to bring to the floor the so-called Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. They want to bring it to a vote. This bill that, as Senator Schumer said, is already covered in law. The bill, they say, creates new standards of care for physicians providing reproductive health care that are not based in medicine, fact, or science. The goal of the bill that we will consider, introduced by the Republicans, is to target and intimidate reproductive health care providers and make it harder for women to access comprehensive and compassionate health care. This bill offers a poorly drafted and dangerous solution to a problem that simply does not exist. The authors of this bill would tell you that this legislation simply ensures that all children born alive as a result of a so-called attempted abortion are provided the same medical care as any other newborn of the same gestational age. They say that's all it does. But we already have a law in the books that ensures that any child born in America, regardless of the circumstances surrounding that birth, is afforded equal protection under the law. In 2002, the House and Senate passed on a bipartisan basis the Born Alive Infants Protection Act. Do you know who signed that into law? Then President George W. Bush. Put simply, it is already illegal to kill a child born alive in America. And in rare cases where a doctor does harm a baby in violation of state and federal laws, they are held legally accountable. The year was 2013. Dr. Kermit Gosnell, a Pennsylvania doctor, was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder for murdering babies after botched abortions. Gosnell was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole under existing law, and he's currently serving that sentence at Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution at Huntington. You know what else the authors of this legislation didn't tell you? They won't tell you that abortions late in pregnancy are incredibly rare. And when they do occur, it is most often because of a heartbreaking, late-breaking, fatal fetal diagnosis, or because a woman's doctor has told her that she may not survive the pregnancy, or because a woman lives in a state that prevented her from getting an abortion earlier. No, Republicans would rather have you believe that vast numbers of women are intentionally waiting until the final days of their pregnancy to have abortions. This is a cruel political contrivance. These are women who often already have had their baby showers, picked out names, persevered through morning sickness, back pain, swollen ankles, countless doctor's appointments and tests. These are women who wanted their babies. And what's the response from the actual doctors on this legislation? Ask the professionals to respond to the Republican bill that's coming to the floor, the so-called Born Alive bill. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists said this when the House passed the bill last year, and I quote, "The offensively named Born Alive legislation is another cruel, misguided attempt to interfere with evidence-based medical decisions being made by patients and their physicians. Laws that ban or criminalize evidence-based care and rely on medically unsupported theories and misinformation are dangerous to families and clinicians. This bill negatively affects all obstetric and gynecological care." What I just read to you is a quote from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Given this reality, what would happen if this bill were signed into law by the new president? Take the case of Meredith Shiner, a constituent of mine in Illinois, who was thrilled to learn a few years ago that she and her husband were going to have a little baby boy. However, at 22 weeks and 6 days, Meredith woke up with a terrible abdominal pain, rushed to the hospital thinking she had a bladder infection. She didn't realize the seriousness of what was happening until the doctor told her she was in labor. The prognosis was grim. Having the baby at 22 weeks and 6 days meant that although the baby would be born alive, the chances of survival were almost non-existent. Knowing medical interventions would be futile, Meredith and her husband made the difficult decision to take the minutes they had with their son, to hold him, to touch him, to look at him until he gently passed away as the doctors provided palliative care. This bill is written in such an overly broad way, vague way, that had it been the law, those same doctors who provided compassionate care to Meredith, her husband, and their son could be subject to 5 years in prison. In these heartbreaking situations, it's not time for politicians to dictate the course of medical treatment as this bill would do. Those wrenching decisions, those personal, tragic moments must be left to medical professionals and the individuals in their care. It's the only compassionate outcome. This week, we lost a lifelong advocate for women's rights, Cecile Richards. She spent her life fighting to keep politics out of health care and defending every woman's right to decide when and how to start their family. We lost Cecile to glioblastoma, the same brain cancer that took John McCain, Beau Biden, and Teddy Kennedy. If Senate Republicans truly cared about saving lives, they'd be working with us to expand access to health care, increase funding for medical research that results in new cures and treatments, and implement policies that address our nation's abysmal record of infant and maternal mortality. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today with my colleagues, Senator Murray and Senator Schumer and Senator Durbin, and my close colleague from Minnesota, Senator Klobuchar, and others, to stand up for women and for doctors in my home state of Minnesota and around the country. And I just want to appreciate Senator Durbin for raising Cecile Richards, who is a dear friend of mine and someone who I worked with closely when I worked at Planned Parenthood. And I was thinking about something that Cecile often pointed to. She would quote the great American poet Edna St. Vincent Millay, and this poet would say, "It's not one damn thing after another. It's the same damn thing over and over again. And here we have that being shown on the Senate floor. Once again, Republicans are here introducing this bill, not to talk about what we can do to lower prices for Americans, not to talk about how we can lower the cost of housing or how to help people's lives become affordable, more affordable. Instead, one of the very first bills that they are putting forward is for a vote in service of a national abortion ban that I can tell you the people in Minnesota do not want. The people in America have made it abundantly clear that they do not want. And I guess the nicest thing you could say about this is that it is out of touch with where Americans are. But let's talk about it a little bit more, because I think it's important that we fight some of the myths and the disinformation that this legislation promotes. You know, what this bill would do, it would put Congress and politicians in the middle of personal medical decisions that patients and doctors should be able to make together without political interference. It would override physicians' professional judgments about what is best for their patients, and it would put physicians in the position of facing criminal penalties if their judgment about what is best for their patients go against what is described in this bill. So, colleagues, let's be clear. At the core of the debate here is whether or not we trust women to make the very best decisions for themselves and their families. And in difficult medical, challenging, often tragic medical situations, should women and their physicians be making decisions about their lives and their health, often their very lives, or is this about politics? And I think Americans say this is not about politics. Politics should stay out of it. I know that everybody on this floor has talked to their own constituents who have experienced what really happens for women who are needing abortion care later in their pregnancy. These stories are inevitably heartbreaking and tragic, and they each are individual and unique. You know, not every situation is different, but they always are about women and families that are thrilled to be pregnant. In some cases, as my colleagues have said, they've already picked out a name, they've decorated the nursery, they planned a baby shower, but it becomes clear as a pregnancy progresses the devastating news that this child is not going to survive. And in some cases, the mother's life is also at risk. Her health, her ability to have children in the future are at risk. And as I said, every situation is going to be unique because everyone is going to have a different diagnosis, different personal histories, different family circumstances, and that means everybody is going to need to have their own individual care. But what every single one of these women have in common is that each one of them deserves the dignity and the autonomy and the freedom to be able to make those decisions, make their own medical decisions without a bunch of politicians getting in the way. But let's be really clear here. Women are not waking up in the last weeks of their pregnancy just to change their mind about that pregnancy. I mean, how disrespectful of women is that attitude, because these are terrible situations where something has gone catastrophically wrong. They're not just changing their minds, they are doing everything they can to take care of themselves and their families. You know, Mr. President, I know that in this country, we don't tell oncologists how to treat their patients. We don't tell emergency room doctors what they need to do in any specific circumstance to save lives. And we shouldn't be telling women's doctors how to take care of their patients. But colleagues, that is what this bill does. It would give politicians in this room a seat in the doctor's offices and in the ERs of women all over this country. And that has an intimidating impact on providers who are already desperately trying to keep their head down and do their jobs while operating under the chaos that has erupted after the Supreme Court overturned Roe. So, colleagues, this should be about treating women with respect. We should be all in agreement that decisions about women's health care aren't different from decisions about men's health care or anyone's health care. So why would we be treating women differently? Colleagues, let's get out of the business of dictating medical care for women. Let's trust women and their doctors. I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation.
The senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I rise today with my colleagues. I want to thank Senator Murray for her leadership, but also Senator Smith, who has long led on this issue and has stood up time and time again for freedoms and reproductive freedom. Yesterday, as she noted, we lost Cecile Richards, who was a true force of nature, who spent her career fighting for reproductive freedom. We lost her just 2 days before what would be the 52nd anniversary of Roe v. Wade. But we all know that our country is now well into its third year without the protections of Roe. In the years since the Supreme Court overturned half a century of precedent and stripped away a woman's right to make her own health care decisions, going against 70–80% of Americans who believe that this decision should be made by a woman or family or doctor and not by politicians who believe, as my colleague just noted, that politicians should not be in the waiting room making the decisions for families. Women are now at the mercy of a patchwork of state laws that are creating chaos when it comes to accessing reproductive care. So the solution is not the bill before us this week. The solution is not to take rare cases of the most tragic nature, as my colleagues have described. I'm a former prosecutor. I know what murder is. Murder is murder, including murder of a baby. We are here talking about tragic cases where doctors have to make a decision in the moment with the family about how they're going to handle very, very tragic situations with the baby. Today, nearly 20 states have enacted some form of abortion restriction. The result, a third of women of reproductive age now live under extreme, dangerous bans. And in states across the country, women are being turned away from emergency rooms, forced to travel hundreds of miles for health care. So adding to that situation, this idea that we're going to start intervening in these rare, tragic cases would be a horrible result for so many women. I'm thinking about the pregnant teenager in Texas who died after being denied care in 3 hospital visits. I'm thinking about the young woman from Florida who was forced to miscarry in a bathroom due to her state's restrictions. By the time she finally got to the hospital, she had lost almost half the blood in her body. And we'll never forget the heartbreaking story of the 10-year-old in Ohio who had to go to Indiana in order to get a legal abortion after she was raped. People said that story was a hoax. It wasn't a hoax. It was true. Doctors are being threatened with prosecution for doing their jobs, an issue that will only get worse if we pass the legislation that Republicans have brought to the floor. We already know that there have been repeated attempts to restrict mifepristone. Just last week, a judge allowed Idaho, Kansas, and Missouri to proceed with their lawsuit challenging FDA approval of the drug, which is safely used in 90 countries. This is our reality right now, but it doesn't have to be our future. I call on our colleagues to join us in codifying Roe v. Wade into law. And simply because someone may have different views. I know many people in my own family who may be pro-life, but they don't believe that their views for what they would do in their personal life would apply to other people. And certainly not women who at the very end of a pregnancy, something they've been so looking forward to, having a baby, have to have the federal government intervene and tell the doctor that he can't do this or she can't do that. This isn't about politics. This isn't about red states and blue states. People across the country on our side on this. And we ask our colleagues to vote with us and reject this bill. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thanks, Mr. President. I'm proud to join my colleagues on the floor today in opposition to the Born Alive Abortion Survivor Protection Act. If you are wondering whether that title to a legislation makes sense, the answer is no, it does not. This legislation is simply a blatant attempt to interfere with evidence-based patient care and medical practices while enshrining lies about abortion care. My Republican colleagues spent the last 4 years calling Democrats alarmists, but here they are aggressively pursuing legislation that would persecute providers for doing their jobs and making a tragic situation for families even worse. Medical professionals are and have always been required by law to provide infants high-quality care from the moment they're born. There's absolutely no evidence that this law is being broken. To suggest otherwise is deeply offensive and dangerous for any family, and all of us know families, if they're not our own. Learning their child will be stillborn or not survive beyond birth is a profound loss, deeply grief-stricken. This legislation would deepen that loss. It would remove any control a woman may have over her pregnancy and force the family to endure unnecessary and unethical medical overreach at the hands of politicians. That's right, at the hands of politicians, not medical personnel. The bill would force physicians to provide invasive and hopeless measures, which are both medically and ethically inappropriate in these situations. That's why the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists strongly oppose this legislative effort. Let's listen to the doctors, the scientists, the professionals, rather than trying to message bill a anti-scientific, anti-medical science stand. We've seen now how overturning Roe has emboldened Republicans across the United States and in this very chamber to make policies based on their own personal beliefs instead of evidence-based practices. This legislation is just another opportunity for Republicans to stand on their soapbox and lie to the American people, but also create fears and apprehensions on the part of people across the country. These policies actively harm families. Pretending otherwise is a slap in the face to those who voted for all of us, and you in particular. Let me close by invoking the spirit of Cecile Richards. After losing her just yesterday, she was a giant. She modeled guts and grit in public service, showing courage and fortitude beyond words as a champion of women's reproductive freedom. I'll always remember her smile, her fierce determination, her endless energy. They will be with me always, and they inspire me to say today to my Republican colleagues, please leave alone the women who deserve doctors' care and that care alone, not our interference. I yield the floor.
Senator from Oregon.
President, I come to the floor today to express my strong opposition to Republicans' so-called Born Alive bill. I want to commend Senator Murray and all my colleagues who've done so much good work on this. This is not the first time the Senate debates this bill on the Senate floor, and I doubt it will be the last. Republicans claim this legislation will protect women and children. The foundation of this Republican bill is that babies are forced to go without basic medical care after they are born. This is a disgusting, stomach-churning lie that is peddled to fearmonger the American people. No child born alive in the United States is denied the health care they need to survive. It is already illegal to do so. In reality, what this bill does is turn what is already an impossibly difficult situation for countless expecting parents into a living hell. Imagine you and your spouse get the good news that you're expecting. You're over the moon until a few months later when you get the worst news you could possibly imagine receiving during pregnancy. For reasons out of your control, your baby has developed a terminal medical condition and will not survive once they're born. On top of that, to force the mother to continue carrying the baby to term would most likely be deadly for her. Many women and couples are all too familiar with the gut-wrenching decisions that come next. What a statement about Republican priorities that this is one of the first pieces of legislation brought to the Senate floor just a few hours after Donald Trump was sworn into office. So, Republicans talk a big game about being pro-life and being the party of family values. Their actions show reality couldn't be any further from the truth. For example, the Republicans recently blocked a bipartisan expansion of the child tax credit that would have really helped to lift kids out of poverty. Now they're gearing up to cut food stamps so kids go hungry. They put Medicaid and health insurance for millions of kids on the chopping block. If Republicans really cared about helping women and children, they'd be using their newfound majority to vote on legislation that cuts housing and child care costs, grocery bills, or keeps moms safe. Let me close this way, Mr. President and colleagues. This deeply flawed Republican born-alive bill is the real Republican agenda on full display. While Republicans are full steam ahead with their crusade against reproductive freedom, all my colleagues who are here today, led by Senator Murray, we're focused on fighting inflation, bringing down costs, getting to work for working families. I'm proud to be associated with their efforts, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I'm pleased to join my colleagues today because I strongly oppose this legislation. I oppose it because it would significantly interfere with the doctor-patient relationship, and I oppose it because it would pose unnecessary and harmful obstacles to a woman's right, to all women's right, to make our own decisions about our own reproductive health. This legislation has one purpose, and that's to make safe abortion services even more inaccessible by intimidating doctors with the threat of criminal liability. This is fear-mongering at its finest, and by choosing to focus on this bill during President Trump's first week in office, some Republicans, and I say some because they don't all support this bill, are choosing to politicize a family's trauma instead of focusing on making life easier, more affordable, and better for all Americans, which President Trump promised when he was campaigning, when he said he wasn't interested in a federal law that would outlaw abortions. Abortions performed later in pregnancy are rare, and they are done as the result of fatal diagnoses for the fetus, the mother, or both. These are tragic, heartbreaking situations that no one, I'm going to repeat that no one wants. And by inserting new uncertainty and risk of criminal liability into the process, this legislation only further increases the risk that a woman will not be able to get the medical care that she needs. This bill ignores these important realities in hopes of scoring political points with anti-choice factions, and the timing is done deliberately because many of those groups are going to be here in Washington on Friday. So we should see this bill for what it is. It's a political stunt, again and again, at every turn. Some Republicans and the Trump administration have pushed forward dangerous policies intended to threaten access to abortion care. I think it's just shameful. They should be ashamed of themselves. This bill is just another battle in a long line of attacks on the ongoing war on women's health. Now more than ever, we need to stand up and defend women's health care, make certain that abortions are safe and legal. And we know that banning abortions doesn't actually stop them. You just make them more dangerous for women. Enough is enough. I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation and its consideration on the Senate floor. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you. I rise, Mr. President, to join my colleagues in opposing this legislation that is the Republican Party's latest effort to take away a woman's fundamental freedom to make her own health care decision and take away a family's fundamental right to navigate heartbreaking and complex health decisions without government interference. I come from the live free or die state, Granted, staters and Americans love freedom. Our country's promise is that freedom belongs to everyone. But today, thanks to the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade and the extreme actions by Republican legislatures in some states, women in America are not free. In a sense, this legislation that we are debating right now is disconnected from reality. This bill ignores a pretty basic fact. Infanticide is illegal in every corner of this country. The claim that this legislation will save lives is disingenuous, and the assumption underlying this bill that an expectant mother would seek an abortion after months of pregnancy for anything but the most dire of reasons shows a deliberate willingness to ignore the realities of women's health. So here are the facts. All that this legislation will do is make it harder for doctors to perform life-saving care for their patients. And it will make it harder for families to make the best healthcare decisions for themselves in moments of great heartbreak as they face the final moments of a desired pregnancy or the final moments of a terminally ill newborn's life. It's also remarkable that this is among the first pieces of legislation that the Republicans have brought to the floor since the inauguration of a new president. This is, of course, legislation in search of a problem, but it is not in search of a motive. Some of my colleagues have decided that rather than address the most pressing issues facing the American people, they will instead push legislation to curtail the freedom of women. Just the latest in their long line of efforts since Roe was overturned to take away more and more freedom from half of the population. I am willing and eager to work with my colleagues to tackle the greatest challenges facing our country. That's what our constituents expect and deserve of us, and something that this bill so clearly fails to do. This legislation will not bring down the price of groceries, nor will it reduce rents or do anything to make it easier for families to make ends meet. But it will make life harder for expectant mothers facing a painful choice. It won't make health care more affordable, though it provides that doctors can be put in jail for providing care for their patients. It won't keep our children safe for crime or fentanyl traffickers, though it will make our daughters less free. This legislation, in short, does nothing to address any of the great challenges that America faces. It seeks only to deny and diminish the freedom of our fellow Americans. But this is what some of our colleagues have decided to focus on during the first full day of the new administration. Across our country, in red states and blue alike, in the distant corners of the land of the free, there is no great clamor to further limit freedom. There is no great clamor to have members of Congress substitute their judgment for that of a woman, her doctors, and her families. But you wouldn't know it if you follow the action of the Senate majority today. We cannot lose sight of what this debate is ultimately about. At the center of this debate is a very simple question. Do we believe in the promise of our Declaration of Independence that all are created equal? Do we believe that freedom belongs to everyone? And do we believe that women deserve to be free and equal citizens in the United States of America? This is America, the world's greatest democracy. Here, women should not be second-class citizens. In this country, each of us is supposed to have the freedom to chart our own future. And we know well that freedom includes the freedom to make personal, private decisions that others may disagree with. Our commitment to putting freedom first, that's part of what makes America different. Indeed, that is what makes us exceptional. The American people understand freedom's importance. Their leaders should remember it too. The American people have not asked for the extreme agenda that this legislation represents. They haven't asked the majority to further restrict their freedom. I urge my colleagues to listen to the American people, put aside this partisan agenda, and get to work to tackle the challenges that are facing our country. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Washington.
I rise today in opposition to this deceptively named Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, because tomorrow is the 52nd anniversary of Roe v. Wade, a decision that guaranteed fundamental rights to choose abortion before that right was stripped away. Multiple states are now, reproductive freedom is under attack in multiple states. Over a dozen states have passed abortion bans, and several pregnant women in Georgia and Texas have died because they could not access safe abortions. In some states, patients don't even have access to legal abortion care even after they have been raped. Multiple states are currently suing to restrict access to even medication for abortion. And we don't yet know how the new administration is going to handle federal protections for pregnant women in medical emergencies. The new administration yesterday took down a government website that offered just information about reproductive care. This was one of the top priorities yesterday of this administration on day one, taking down that website. But instead of working to resolve any of the serious, real challenges, my colleagues are instead trying to force a vote on something that is completely unnecessary. It is already illegal to kill a child who is born alive in this country. I was a member of the Senate when we passed in 2002 the Born Alive Infant Protection Act to ensure that all infants have legal protections. The so-called Born Alive Abortion Survivors Act, as my colleague from New Hampshire just said, is legislation in search of a problem. It's deliberately misleading and offensive to pregnant people and to their health care providers. It is incredibly heartbreaking, these scenarios, where a baby is born with a fatal diagnosis, that the baby's parents must want to spend those precious moments holding and saying goodbye to their child. But under these extreme ideas, doctors would have to perform aggressive medical care that would only prolong a family's suffering. We need to honor that these are medical decisions left to the woman and her physician and to her family, and we trust that doctors and nurses know how to carry this out. We want to honor these, not politicians, not lawyers, and so I will be voting against this legislation, and I urge my colleagues to do so. We also need to make sure that here in the Senate, as my colleague has said, we're working to lower costs. We need to make sure that they don't try to cut Medicare or food assistance or the neediest issues for young families who are being impacted. Health care in the United States need to be strengthened, drug costs need to be lowered, and we need to help and protect working families. I thank my colleagues for being here today, and I yield the floor.